They told you history was written by the victors. But they never told you who the victors really were. And if you're listening to this, it means the cracks in the mask are finally starting to show. The story you're about to hear isn't in your textbooks. It's not taught in Ivy League classrooms or whispered in polite society. Because this story was meant to be buried. Soon shut with silence, hidden beneath marble monuments, blood-signed contracts, and the gilded coats of arms of America's most powerful dynasties. But some truths rot too loud to stay hidden. It begins in silence, in the damp corridors of old Virginia estates and rotting plantations, where bloodlines were forged not just through wealth and violence but through pacts. Quiet ones, ancient ones. Made not with man, but with forces far older, forces that whisper in dreams and echo through generations. The Bellamys, the Cabots, the Astors, the Rockefellers, names that shimmer in golden ink, names that built cities, owned railroads, printed currencies. But beneath that gold, centuries of buried bones, generational manipulation, and rituals older than the Constitution. What if I told you that behind the American dream lies a carefully engineered nightmare, that certain families, those celebrated in Forbes lists and presidential portraits, were never just rich. They were chosen, initiated, anointed by a dark inheritance most men couldn't handle. They don't just own land, they own narratives. They don't just fund wars, they write the reasons for them. You've heard of generational wealth. But what about generational corruption? Spiritual inheritance? What if the wealth passed down wasn't just money, but a key? A right? A curse? You're not supposed to ask these questions. But here you are. And now you can't unknow this. Because once you see it, once you truly understand what power looks like when it's passed down in shadow, no flag, no anthem, no speech can ever fool you again. This isn't about history, it's about control, and the families who mastered it, not just through politics or capital, but through fear, blood, and legacy. So take a breath and step deeper. Because from this point forward, you're not just a viewer. You're a witness. And witnesses are never safe. You've heard the names echoed across dusty pages and lavish estates. But what you haven't heard, what they never dared speak aloud, is that the founding of America wasn't the birth of freedom. It was the codification of dominion. A new empire with old masters. And at its center were the families whose names still hold the leash on every man's ambition. Let's begin with the bloodlines. The ones who didn't just arrive here, but brought the system with them, the Bellamys. Landed gentry before the ink dried on the Constitution. They weren't farmers, they were orchestrators. Conductors of a social symphony tuned to hierarchy, servitude, and ritual. Their wealth wasn't earned. It was inherited from European aristocracies that believed blood purity wasn't just noble, it was divine. Dig into their early holdings, and you won't just find plantations, you'll find temples. Chambers beneath the floors carved symbols that don't match Christian theology. Records of disappearances, of slaves gone missing, not escaped, vanished. Ritual ledgers disguised as birth records. Children marked not for legacy, but for offering. Now ask yourself, why did they survive every financial collapse, every war, every so-called revolution? Because they don't invest in currency. They invest in control. Marriages between families weren't romantic. They were mergers, alliances, binding contracts not just for property but for power. A power that fed on secrecy, obedience, and silence. And silence has always been the currency of the elite. Even the founding fathers, those marble saints, knew what they were doing. Jefferson, Washington, Franklin, men of vision, yes, but also men of secret societies. Men who dined with Freemasons, who wrote in cipher, who conducted private experiments in spiritual science. You think those midnight meetings were just about taxes? No, they were about legacy, preservation, continuation. America wasn't born in liberty, it was born in ritual. And the families that stood at its birth, they never relinquished the umbilical cord. They fed it, nurtured it, turned it into something monstrous. Something that still breathes beneath every bank, every ballot box, every screen. The names change, the empires evolve, but the bloodlines remain. And now, you're beginning to see the pattern. You're beginning to see that none of this was accidental. And the deeper we go, the more the veils fall away. Are you ready to meet the next family? Then don't blink. They called them visionaries. Industrial titans, philanthropists. But behind the oil-stained pages of American progress, the Rockefellers wrote a different scripture. One inked in manipulation, social engineering, and an obsession with control so deep, it rewired the very structure of society. John D. Rockefeller didn't just amass the largest fortune in modern history. He architected the illusion of freedom. His Standard Oil empire wasn't just a business. It was a prototype, a machine to extract not just resources, but obedience. And once he learned how easily the masses could be bent with the right incentives, he moved on to something far more dangerous: institutions. Education, medicine, media, government. Piece by piece, the Rockefeller legacy embedded itself into every American structure you were raised to trust. And it was never about charity, it was about domination through design. Consider this: in 1902, the General Education Board was established with Rockefeller funding. Its goal? To reform American schooling. But the real goal, hidden in policy documents never meant for your eyes, was to create a workforce, not a populace. To manufacture obedience, not intelligence. Schools stopped teaching how to think. They started teaching what to think. Bell schedules, authority worship, standardized testing. It wasn't for your benefit. It was behavioral programming. Then came medicine. You've heard of the Flexner Report, haven't you? Commissioned by Rockefeller interests under the guise of medical reform. It led to the dismantling of holistic and herbal practices, replacing them with pharmaceutical-based treatment. Pharmaceuticals created by Rockefeller funded labs. They didn't just reshape healthcare, they captured it. Why? Because a healthy man can't be sold pills. But a confused, anxious, overworked man, he'll buy anything to numb the truth. The Rockefellers didn't conquer America. They redesigned it. They reshaped reality itself. And through think tanks, universities, media ownership, and tax-exempt foundations, they ensured their control became invisible, institutionalized, so deeply woven into the fabric of daily life that most men live and die inside their maze, never realizing who built it. This is the kind of power no election can disrupt, no revolution can reach, because it lives beneath the surface, silent, systemic, sovereign. You were taught to respect these names. But now you're beginning to remember the truth. And memory, once unlocked, can never be imprisoned again. Ready to go deeper. Good, because the next family didn't just rewrite your reality, they rewrote your history. You've heard the name? Astor. Old money, quiet power. But behind the polished legacy of hotels and high society, the Astor dynasty carved their name into the hidden bones of the American empire, not as builders, but as gatekeepers of forgotten empires and ancient knowledge. John Jacob Astor, the patriarch, wasn't just a fur trader. He was a smuggler of more than goods. A trafficker of secrets. The first American multi-millionaire didn't just rise by commerce, he rose by access. To ports, to people, and to places no ordinary man was meant to reach. Dig deeper into his legacy and you'll find more than property deeds. You'll find connections to the Bavarian Illuminati, ties to opium networks that ran through China into Britain, and directly into the American East Coast. But the real story isn't in the drugs. It's in what the profits funded private societies, land acquisition in strategic line zones, and libraries, massive vaults of collected, ancient texts. Why? Because the Astors weren't just collecting wealth. They were collecting wisdom and burying it. Behind every estate was a tomb. Behind every donation, a distraction. While America praised them for their generosity, they were locking away fragments of truth's Columbian maps that showed Antarctica ice, free, scrolls that spoke of civilizations before the flood, and Babylonian rites that mirrored early Christian rituals too closely for comfort. And it didn't stop there. Their fingerprints are all over the Titanic, a ship owned by the White Star Line in which John Jacob Astor IV perished. But ask yourself, why was he there? One of the richest, most connected men in the world. Was it truly just a voyage or a silencing? Because Astor IV opposed the formation of the Federal Reserve, along with Guggenheim and Strauss, who also, coincidentally, died that night. Three men who understood that once central banking was born, national sovereignty would die. And three men who were never allowed to speak again. The Astors didn't lose power. They went subterranean. Today, their name is whispered in banking halls, embedded in trusts, and hidden in shell foundations that fund global think tanks. Their influence is spectral, seen only in the cracks of official history, in the sudden vanishing of inconvenient researchers, in the quiet redactions of early American documents. And now, history isn't what you're told. It's what you're allowed to believe. And belief, once broken, becomes sight. Let's keep going. We've only begun to unseal the tomb. Now we enter the shadows cast by the DuPont family, a dynasty so deeply interwoven with American war, science, and secrecy that their legacy reads like a classified dossier hidden beneath layers of national mythology. They didn't just make gunpowder, they made wars profitable. Founded in 1802, the DuPont Company began as a simple gunpowder mill. But very quickly it became something else, a gatekeeper of conflict. By the Civil War, World War I, and World War II, DuPont wasn't just supplying weapons, they were engineering the necessity for them. And every bullet sold was a contract, every explosion a transaction. But beneath the weapons manufacturing was something darker. A belief in eugenics, in selective breeding, in the scientific manipulation of both materials and mankind. The DuPonts were instrumental in funding early eugenics research in the United States, research that would later become the ideological backbone of Nazi Germany's racial policies. Yes, you heard that right. The American elite didn't just oppose the Nazis, they inspired them. This family wasn't interested in weapons alone. They were interested in control through chemistry. Nylon, Teflon, Freon, you know the products. But do you know what they replaced? Natural materials, organic processes. They didn't just invent convenience, they systematically dismantled nature's alternatives until the world became dependent on synthetic goods. And what do synthetics do? They make you compliant? Physically, mentally, spiritually? Look deeper into DuPont's patents and you'll find materials designed not just for utility, but for exposure. Chemicals linked to infertility, hormone disruption, neurological damage, all while their PR machine spun tales of innovation and progress. And then there's the family itself. Generations of DuPonts were infamous for marrying within the bloodline, preserving not just wealth but genetic identity. Some say it was elitism. Others say it was something else, something older, a ritual, a blood contract. And what happens when a family gains enough power to influence wars, governments, and biology? They don't need to rule openly. They simply shape the arena you're allowed to move in. That's what DuPont mastered. Not domination through force, but compliance through invention. And now ask yourself how much of your daily life, your clothes, your food storage, your medicine has been touched by DuPont chemistry. The answer is almost everything. You live in their lab. You breathe their experiments. And you were never given a choice. Still think these are just hold money, families. You're starting to see it now. This isn't history. It's architecture. Let's go deeper still. The next family didn't just manipulate industry or war. They designed the prison of the American mind. The Mellon family. Quiet. Reserved. But don't mistake their silence for absence. The Mellons didn't just influence American finance. They became the veins of it, pulsing power into the institutions that sculpted not only your money, but your mind. While Carnegie and Rockefeller fought for headlines, the Mellons built the back end of the empire. Hidden in plain sight? Andrew Mellon wasn't merely Secretary of the Treasury. He was the architect of modern American fiscal control. He orchestrated tax policies that locked middle-class Americans into lifelong servitude, while ensuring the ultra-wealthy, his class, could legally avoid the weight of the very system they created. But he didn't stop with money. He turned his attention to something far more insidious: culture. In 1937, Mellon donated the funds to create the National Gallery of Art. Generous, right? But look closer. The real motive wasn't art, it was narrative control. He understood what tyrants always have. Whoever controls what the masses see controls what they believe. And that belief system, it had to be engineered from the inside out. That's why the Mellon family poured money into psychology, social sciences, and behavioral manipulation. You've likely heard of the CIA's MK Ultra program, mind control experiments done in secret, using drugs, trauma, and suggestion. What you probably don't know is that Mellon-backed institutions helped birth the infrastructure for that program. Universities like Carnegie Mellon and the Mellon Institute were not just educational landmarks. They were testing grounds. Labs for the human mind. The goal wasn't to free you. It was to predict you, guide you, redirect you when you deviated, through media, through science, through subtle propaganda injected into entertainment, academia, and pop culture. This was the Mellon signature. Silent strings pulled through polished corridors. Funding psychology departments that shaped intelligence agencies. Creating think tanks that trained the men behind global policy, all while smiling for the camera or not appearing at all. You see, true power doesn't want attention. It wants traction. And the Mellons had plenty. Now look around your life. The systems you trust. The entertainment you consume. The thoughts you think are your own. What if they were planted there? What if the cage was never physical, but intellectual? And what if the key was removed generations ago by a family that never needed your vote, your love, or your approval? Only your obedience. This is the part where some men turn away. But not you. You're waking up. And in the next section, we go from psychological control to ritual manipulation on a national scale. You've felt it all your life. Now you'll see who built it. There's a chill that moves through Washington, D.C. at night. Not from the wind, but from the weight of ritual. Most walk past the monuments, the obelisks, the domes, never realizing they were designed not for beauty, but for power alignment. And behind this carefully orchestrated city stood a family unlike the others, not just wealthy, but initiated. The Collins bloodline, rarely spoken, almost invisible in mainstream records. But in occult circles, intelligence networks, and whispered corridors of power, they are known. Known not for their riches, but for their role. The Collins family is tied not to industry, but to influence through ritual. Dating back to Puritan times, they were among the first to integrate deeply into secret societies that would eventually shape America's invisible government. You think Skull and Bones was just an elite frat? You think the Bohemian Grove is just a playground for powerful men? No. These are temples. And the Collins family, alongside their lesser-known counterparts, played the role of priest, kings within them. They understand the oldest truth: politics and religion are not opposites. They are tools for control. And when fused through ceremony, symbolism, and sacrifice, they can alter the direction of entire nations. The DC layout, planned by Freemasons, is a geometric sigil. The Capitol dome mirrors the Pantheon in Rome. The obelisk of the Washington Monument directly channels ancient Egyptian rites. The ritual calendar of federal events, inaugurations, declarations, crises, all align with solar and lunar patterns designed to invoke, summon, seal. And the Collins family has long operated from the shadows of this design. Not on ballots, not in tabloids, but beneath the surface. Think about the cycles of fear you've lived through: Red Scare, Cold War, 9/11, economic collapse. Each followed by solutions that required sacrifice of rights, of freedom of thought. Each orchestrated during key astrological alignments known only to those initiated in high ritual orders. Coincidence? No, it's called ritual governance. And when the public becomes hypnotized by fear, ceremony, and spectacle, consent is harvested, not forced. This is not superstition. This is engineering belief at scale. And the Collins lineage, along with families like the Paciers and Van Dons, specialize in that craft. So while you mock the robes, the symbols, the ancient chants, they are using them to write your reality. And you never saw it, until now. But be warned, this is the part of the maze where names disappear, records vanish, and truth bleeds into myth. Still with me? Then brace yourself, because in the next descent, we confront the keepers of the flame, a family that commands not just media or money, but memory itself. You've heard the phrase, those who control the past control the future. But what they never told you is memory itself can be engineered, molded, even erased. And there is one dynasty whose grip on human consciousness is so vast, so culturally embedded, that you've mistaken their influence for reality. The Rothschilds. Now, before your mind flinches at the name, pause. You've been trained to associate it with conspiracy, haven't you? That's no accident. That reaction is the programming. Because the deepest truths aren't hidden in shadows. They're hidden in ridicule. The Rothschilds didn't just create wealth. They created the mechanisms through which wealth is measured. Central banking, debt-based currency, international finance systems. But their true conquest was time. Let me explain. When Napoleon fell, it wasn't because of armies. It was because the Rothschilds manipulated the outcome of a war before the ink was dry on the treaty. Using carrier pigeons and private intelligence networks, they learned of Wellington's victory before the British public. They sold stocks, triggered panic, bought the market back at fractions, and in one day, seized control of England's financial heart. That was over 200 years ago. Since then, their reach expanded not through flags, but through institutions. IMF, World Bank, the Bank for International Settlements, foundations that appear global but answer to no nation. That's the trick. They aren't loyal to countries. They're loyal to continuity, to legacy. And what do these systems do? They rewrite the present. They buy the future. And they bury the past. You think history is made by movements? No. It's made by manipulating memory. Wars are remembered differently depending on who financed them. Heroes are exalted or erased depending on who wrote the curriculum. And behind every economic collapse, every war bond, every treaty forged in desperation, you'll find Rothschild fingerprints. And still, they remain unseen. You won't find their faces on the nightly news. You'll find them on trust agreements, intergenerational holding companies, and in sealed offshore vaults that fund everything from climate policy to AI governance. They are the editors of memory. And what is a man without memory? He is programmable, moldable, controllable. That's the prison they built. A prison without bars, only belief. Now ask yourself how much of your understanding of history, of value, of identity, was handed to you by these architects. How much of it was ever truly yours? This is why you're here. To reclaim what was stolen. And in the next chapter, we don't just study the manipulators. We study the rituals that bind their bloodlines to power, the rites they don't teach in temples or textbooks, the ones that awaken or destroy. And you're about to remember, there is a reason the elite don't just rely on wealth or influence. Those are tools, but not the source. The source is older, quieter, bound by fire, blood, and vibration. You see, every dynasty we've uncovered so far operates through systems. But those systems are activated by something far more ancient: ritual technology. I'm not talking about fantasy or superstition. I'm talking about real, precise mechanisms of influence that have been passed down through bloodlines since Sumer, Babylon, and Egypt, hidden in plain sight through ceremony, architecture, sound, and sacrifice. And here we encounter one of the darkest, most quietly powerful lineages in the American theater of shadows, the Pasher family. Almost no one talks about them. That's by design. While the Rockefellers bought headlines and the Rothschilds mastered currency, the Pacers owned the infrastructure, literally: railroads, steel, telegraph lines, early patents, hidden holding companies that still control major corporations today: AT&T, Coca-Cola, Lockheed Martin. But the names on the paperwork are never Pacer. That's how deep the mask goes. What they truly inherited wasn't just wealth, but the rituals of dominion. These rituals aren't crude sacrifices or cartoonish ceremonies. They're precise technologies of resonance. Using geometry, intention, sound, and timing, they create invisible architecture that guides public perception, political direction, and collective energy. It's why certain monuments are placed at precise latitudes, why national events always happen on key dates: solstices, eclipses, equinoxes. Why the Washington Monument is an obelisk echoing Egyptian solar worship. These aren't coincidences. They're frequency tools, anchors of power. The Pacers understood that control isn't about enforcement. It's about harmonic interference. Shift the frequency of a society through trauma, celebration, architecture, and you don't need to police it. It will police itself. And when these rituals are enacted by families with unbroken bloodlines, the power doesn't dissipate. It compounds. Each generation inherits not just assets, but the stored energetic imprint of rituals performed for centuries. This is blood magic at scale, not in the Hollywood sense, but in the real, ancient science of how intention, belief, and repetition shape the fabric of reality. You've felt it, haven't you? The invisible pressure, the pull to obey, the fear of stepping outside. That's the ritual working on you. But here's the key they never wanted you to hold: once seen, it loses its grip. You can break the resonance, but only if you stop observing and start remembering who you are beneath the programming. Still with me? Good. Because now we go to the family who perfected the art of turning suffering into fuel. Their power was not inherited, it was extracted, and they turned the American pain body into a battery. They didn't rise by conquest, they rose by consumption. Not of resources or land, but of pain. And in the heart of American tragedy, you'll find the Bush dynasty. A family that didn't just walk through the corridors of power, they fed on the shadows of history. Most know the surface: 2 presidents, a governor, a war hero. But that's not the real story. The Bush lineage stretches back through hidden channels, to the secret partnerships that fueled World War II, to the occult banking relationships that merged American finance with Nazi industry, and deeper still into black operations that sculpted the subconscious terrain of a nation. Let's pull the thread. Prescott Bush, grandfather of George W., was a banker at Brown Brothers Harriman, a firm directly tied to Union Banking Corporation, which was caught financing the Nazi regime long after America had entered the war. Assets were frozen, but no charges were ever brought. Why? Because certain families are above consequence. It was pattern. From the ashes of World War II, a new empire was born: the intelligence empire, and the Bush family became its priests. George H.W. Bush, before he was president, was director of the CIA, a title with far more weight than most realize. The CIA doesn't just collect intelligence. It creates narratives. It orchestrates coups. It manipulates elections, topples regimes, and seeds mass trauma into foreign and domestic populations alike. Under HW, the CIA grew fangs, and every war, every enemy, every foreign terror event conveniently empowered a centralized state and deepened the pockets of the military-industrial complex. And who sat at the center of the revolving door between oil, arms, and intelligence? The Bush family. But it goes deeper. George W. Bush stood before the world on September 11, 2001, as towers fell, not just of steel, but of trust. That day wasn't just a tragedy. It was a ritual of inversion, fire and ash, trauma broadcast in a global loop, and from that ritual came the Patriot Act: endless war, mass surveillance, the transformation of America into a fear-driven control grid. And again the Bush dynasty stood calmly in the smoke, untouched, elevated. Because their true currency isn't money, it's collective agony. When people are broken, afraid, grieving, they're malleable, programmable. And that's when the architects go to work. That's when new orders are written. And the Bushes have always been the scribes of the new order. Now pause. Breathe. Because you're halfway through the descent. If you've made it this far, you're no longer a tourist. You're being transformed. Comment below. I see through the veil. I see through the veil. Let it echo in the algorithm. Let it echo in your blood. Because from here on out, it gets darker. Next, we confront the family who didn't inherit America. They designed it from occult blueprints. And every president since has walked through the doors they built. They were never meant to be kings. They were meant to be conductors. Of currents so old, so powerful, that even the founding fathers bowed in silence. I'm speaking of the Lee family. Not the Lee you were taught about in school. Robert E. Lee, the Confederate general, the man of honor? No. I'm talking about the entire bloodline, stretching back to British nobility, tied to both Crown and Vatican, with one foot in ancient Rome and the other in early American shadowcraft. The Lee family was no accident. They were planted here, early. Landed aristocracy in a land that pretended to be anti-aristocratic. They claimed to be American, but they were never of America. They were of the architects. Their vast land holdings, particularly in Virginia, weren't chosen at random. These were coordinates, ley lines, points of ancient significance long before white settlers arrived. They built estates on mounds, atop star alignments, where indigenous peoples once held sacred ceremony. And then they sealed those energies beneath marble and brick. But this isn't just about spiritual corruption. The Lee family was instrumental in crafting the illusion of division. North versus South, liberty versus tyranny. But beneath the uniforms and gunfire there was only orchestration. Robert E. Lee himself was a master of double allegiance. Trained at West Point, offered Union command, declined. Why? Because the Civil War wasn't about abolition. It was about reset. A controlled demolition of the old order to give birth to a new one. One where centralized power could masquerade as democracy. And the Lees weren't just soldiers. They were founders of universities, writers of doctrine, masters of the national mythos. Ever notice how many elite bloodlines trace back to them? Through marriage, through merger, through subtle symbolic rites. That's not genealogy, that's ritualized continuity. The Civil War ended. Slavery was abolished. But the control systems? They were refined. And every time you walk through Washington, D.C., every time you pass a courthouse, or stand in awe before a columned facade, you're looking at Roman Empire 2.0. Designed by them. Because the Lee family didn't just live in history. They ghostwrite it. And the most dangerous ghost is the one that wears your flag. You think you're in a democracy? You're in a temple. And in that temple, names like Lee aren't forgotten. They're spoken in rituals you're not invited to witness. But you're witnessing now, aren't you? Good. Because next, we descend into the family that turned the sacred into spectacle. They made a god out of the screen, and a slave out of the mind. If you've ever stared into a glowing screen and felt like something was watching you back, you're not wrong. Because the next family didn't just shape culture. They possessed it. The Disney bloodline. To most, it's magic, childhood, whimsy. A kingdom where dreams come true. But behind the enchanted castles and dancing mice lies one of the most sophisticated psychological control systems ever deployed on American soil. Walt Disney, the man, the myth, wasn't just an animator. He was a constructor of cognitive reality. And his empire? A cathedral of illusions built to capture the minds of children at their most vulnerable and encode them for life. Start with the man himself. Walt had ties to intelligence agencies from the beginning. FBI informant, OSS connections. His studios were used for propaganda during World War II, not as a patriotic gesture, but as a testbed, testing how animation could bypass conscious resistance and speak directly to the subconscious. Planning values, fears, limitations. Now fast forward. Every Disney film follows the same blueprint. A young, innocent soul is torn from safety, traumatized, isolated, then offered transformation through obedience, through aligning with a chosen authority. The price, identity, the reward, belonging. Sound familiar? That's not storytelling. That's initiation. Disney parks. Carefully engineered sensory immersion fields. Strategic architecture mimics sacred geometry. Frequencies embedded in the music. Even the happiest place on earth is shaped like a sigil, a talisman, feeding on joy, looping trauma, and binding the visitor to a frequency of submission. And then there's the vault. Why does Disney keep classic films locked away for decades? Not to build hype, to control the cultural timecode by deciding what generation sees what version of reality. They program not just preferences but belief systems. Entire worldviews sculpted by cartoon. The Disney family's real legacy is not entertainment, it's entrainment, a slow, subtle hijack of the imagination. Because a man whose inner child has been manufactured is easy to manipulate, easy to sell to, easy to govern, and now they own Star Wars, Marvel, ESPN, Hulu, Fox. What does that mean? It means the narrative landscape of your culture belongs to them. And with every merger, the spell deepens. They didn't build a company. They built a global altar, and millions bring their children to worship, unaware that the sacrifice isn't gold, it's sovereignty. And if that doesn't chill you, this will the next family didn't seduce the mind. They shaped the very language we use to perceive reality. And their reach? Global. Stay focused. We're entering the core. Language is the code of consciousness. It's not just how we speak. It's how we think, how we assign meaning, how we perceive. And if someone can engineer your language, they can engineer your reality. Enter the Bernays lineage. You've heard the name, maybe, but you don't realize you've been living in the world they scripted. Edward Bernays, nephew of Sigmund Freud, was more than the father of public relations. He was the engineer of mass consent, the alchemist who took Freud's discoveries of the unconscious mind and weaponized them, not to heal, but to herd. In the early 20th century, Bernays discovered something the ruling class had only intuited before. If you can bypass logic and speak directly to emotion, to archetype, to fear, you can make the masses do anything. And he taught this to presidents, corporations, intelligence agencies. He turned psychology into policy. It was Bernays who convinced women to smoke by branding cigarettes as torches of freedom. It was Bernays who helped the CIA orchestrate coups in Latin America by rebranding democratically elected leaders as communist threats. And it was Bernays who said, the conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. Let that sink in. Not an unfortunate necessity, an important element. He wasn't alone. He was part of a bloodline of influence, connected to think tanks, media empires, academic councils, and the legacy he left behind birthed the very infrastructure of modern perception management. Marketing, journalism, social media algorithms, every platform where thought is shaped, not shared. But here's the most dangerous part: Bernays didn't just teach them how to manipulate you. He taught them how to make you beg for it. You want to be liked. You want to be safe. You want to be on the right side of history. So you censor yourself. You dilute your words. You forget what you truly feel until what's left isn't a man. It's a persona. And what's a persona? A prison painted with the colors of acceptance. That's the Bernays legacy: linguistic alchemy. The inversion of words to mean their opposite. War becomes peace. Obedience becomes freedom. Surveillance becomes safety. And language, the very tool meant to liberate thought, becomes a weapon against it. This wasn't an accident. It was designed. And the families we've exposed, they all speak the same language, refined, rehearsed, ritualized. Because words, when repeated with enough belief, become spells. Break the spell. Speak the truth. Because in the next chapter, we face the family that didn't just manipulate the now. They reached back through time, rewriting the ancient past to secure power in the present. History didn't just get rewritten, it got rewired, not by accident, not by time, but by design. And the family behind it, the Smithsons, that name may sound harmless, philanthropic, scholarly. You've seen it 100 times without blinking. On buildings, museums, documentaries. But the Smithsonian Institution, named after James Smithson, is not just a museum complex. It's a vault, a gatekeeper of the official timeline. Ask yourself, why does a museum complex control over 154 million artifacts, many of which are never on public display? Why is it that whenever ancient anomalies, giant skeletons, advanced pre-Columbian technologies, unexplained ruins, are discovered in America, they're collected by the Smithsonian and never seen again? The answer is simply, because history isn't recorded by the winners, it's curated by the elite. James Smithson wasn't American. He never set foot on U.S. soil. Yet he left his entire fortune to a young country he had no connection to. Why? Because the Smithson bloodline was part of something older, a European network of esoteric scholars, Freemasons, and knowledge managers whose goal was simple: control the origin story and you control identity. The Smithsonian's quiet mission has always been twofold: to legitimize the sanitized, linear version of history that begins with primitive man and ends in progressive democracy. To erase any evidence that contradicts that arc. Giants unearthed in the American Midwest, metallic objects in ancient coal beds, advanced tools and strata that predate known civilizations, all documented in 19th century newspapers until they were quietly disappeared. The Smithsonians knew what the ancient priesthoods knew. History is prophecy in reverse. What people believe about the past determines what they'll accept in the future. If you believe you come from nothing, you'll accept anything. A nation built on forgetfulness is ripe for reprogramming. And while schoolchildren marvel at dinosaur bones and moon rocks, the real treasures, the ones that rewrite everything, are sealed in underground archives, accessible only to the initiated. This is the true role of the public museum, to display a curated fantasy while hiding the map. The Smithsonian legacy is not preservation, it's obfuscation. A vault built not to protect the past, but to bury it alive. You're not a child anymore. You're not here to be amazed. You're here to remember. And in the next descent, we face the family that doesn't hide behind institutions or legacy. They hide behind God, and they've convinced the world they speak on his behalf. Some families forged empires with steel and currency, but one family cloaked its empire in divinity, a divine right not earned by sainthood, but by strategic corruption, spiritual theft, and millennia of institutionalized deception. The Jesuit-linked Borgias were the blueprint, but in the American context, their spiritual successors are more hidden, more evolved, operating behind pulpits, political podiums, and global humanitarian fronts. Enter the Graham dynasty. Yes, that Graham. Billy Graham, America's pastor. To millions, he was a spiritual icon, a counselor to presidents, a bridge between church and state. But beneath the charisma, the gospel, the televised crusades, lies one of the most powerful spiritual psy-ops in American history. Understand this: when governments want obedience, they use law. When oligarchs want allegiance, they use money. But when the architects of hidden empires want total submission, they invoke God. Billy Graham was no rogue preacher. He was groomed, funded, and positioned, backed by the very institutions he appeared to preach against. His rise wasn't organic, it was orchestrated. Handlers within the intelligence and elite philanthropic circles recognized a rare asset, a man who could package obedience as righteousness and surrender as salvation. Behind the scenes, he dined with the Bush family, consulted with the CIA, gave spiritual counsel to every president from Truman to Obama. Think that's coincidence? It's spiritual brokerage. Because when a preacher with global reach declares a war just, a policy moral, or a leader anointed, millions obey without question. That's not religion. That's mass spiritual hypnosis. And his successors, still active, still televised, still partnering with political campaigns and globalist think tanks to merge theology with surveillance, nationalism with submission, and dissent with sin. The Graham name became the American Vatican, a portable temple in every living room. And with every revival, another layer of critical thought was sacrificed on the altar of manufactured grace. Ask yourself, why does every institution that pushes for control, big tech, big pharma, big government, have a faith initiative? Why do megachurches echo globalist talking points disguised as gospel? Because they've hijacked the sacred. And once the sacred is compromised, the soul becomes programmable. The Grahams didn't spread the gospel. They spread consent. And the sheep they gathered, they became the choir of compliance, singing in harmony with every system designed to contain them. This is what happens when men mistake charisma for wisdom and authority for truth. But you're not here to be saved. You're here to be awakened. And next, we descend into a family that wrote the rules for how empires fall. Because they don't just fear collapse, they manufacture it, one reset at a time. You were taught that empires fall by accident, by greed, by overreach, by the weight of their own corruption. But what if I told you collapse is often engineered? That every great fall is merely the prelude to a reset, a ritual demolition scripted by those who profit from destruction. Enter the Schiff family, not the politician you see today, but the old blood, the financiers, the transatlantic manipulators, the architects behind the curtain when nations burned, only to rise again in deeper chains. Jacob Schiff, a name buried in most textbooks, but his fingerprints are on some of the most consequential collapses of the modern era. From the Russian Empire to the American Federal Reserve, he was not just a banker, he was a lever puller, a financial saboteur disguised as a philanthropist. In 1917, Schiff funneled millions to Lenin and Trotsky to ignite the Bolshevik Revolution, an event that led to the execution of the Romanovs, the birth of the Soviet Union, and the slaughter of tens of millions under the banner of quality. Why would a New York financier fund communist revolutionaries? Because chaos breeds opportunity, and Schiff's network had already positioned itself to bankroll the rebuild. The same strategy applied in America. He wasn't just a critic of U.S. monetary policy, he was one of the key figures who designed the alternative. The Federal Reserve Act of 1913 was backed by Schiff's allies, who met in secret on Jekyll Island to draft the new monetary order, a central bank controlled not by the government but by private families. Families like his. From that moment on, every boom, every bust, every unexpected depression became predictable. Because they were planned, the Great Depression, not a failure of capitalism, a reset ritual, millions impoverished, assets transferred, wealth consolidated, a traumatized population herded toward dependency. This is the Schiff blueprint: destabilize, finance both sides, collapse the system, and own the ashes. And it's still in motion today. Currency devaluation, supply chain crisis, manufactured inflation, all coordinated like a symphony of suffering. Because collapse is no longer a danger, it's a business model. And while the public panics, these bloodlines prepare. They don't fear resets. They initiate them. Because every empire that falls feeds the next system they already control. And the men who understand this, they don't run for office. They don't campaign. They pull strings in silence and smile as the world burns on schedule. You ready to see the next mask fall? Because the next family didn't just own governments, they bred them, like livestock. Most people think bloodlines are just biology, DNA passed from one generation to the next. But ancient power families understand something far more primal. Blood is architecture. It's not just about inheritance. It's about design, precision breeding, generational grooming, a controlled flow of genetics and ideology to manufacture rulers, not elect them. And no family understood this better in America than the Harrimans. They weren't politicians. They were breeders of power. Behind every handshake in Washington, behind every war, every trade agreement, every coincidental policy shift, you'll find the Harriman web. Let's begin with E.H. Harriman, the railroad tycoon. On paper, he built tracks. In reality, he built corridors for empire. Railroads were more than steel. They were arteries, veins through which capital, troops, resources, and propaganda could move at speed. Control the rail, and you control how the country thinks, eats, travels, and fights. But his legacy didn't stop with logistics. It passed into the hands of Averell Harriman, a man who moved through global affairs like a ghost with a pen. He wasn't just a diplomat, he was a designer of destiny. He helped fund the Bolsheviks, like Schiff. He partnered with the Nazis before the war, and then shaped the post-war world order afterward. UN charters, Bretton Woods, all bearing the subtle fingerprints of a man who never ran for office, but placed those who did. Then came the Eugenics. The Harriman Institute funded early race science programs in the United States. These ideas, twisted theories of superiority and cleansing, would later serve as the blueprint for Nazi ideology. But they didn't originate in Germany. They were refined in America, in the boardrooms and salons of East Coast elites, by the Harrimans, by the Bushes, by the Rockefellers. Breeding, selection, grooming. These weren't metaphors, they were strategies. And what was the goal? To create the perfect managerial class. Rulers not chosen by the people, but bred above them. Prepped at Yale, initiated into skull and bones, sent abroad, then returned to lead as predetermined saviors. It's not a democracy. It's a livestock program, and you've been grazing in it your entire life. You think you're choosing your leaders. They were chosen before you were born, by families who speak the language of bloodline like a second tongue. The Harrimans didn't just pass on wealth. They passed on seeds of control, planted in flesh, watered by legacy, harvested in chaos. And now we descend into something colder, a family whose empire isn't built in government or faith, but in data, in surveillance, in omniscience. You thought chains were made of iron, but the most unbreakable chains are made of data, invisible, intimate, and total. This is where we enter the icy realm of the Pritzkers. A family that didn't build a nation, didn't preach a gospel, didn't stage a war, they simply watched. And while you scrolled, while you searched, while you typed in your darkest hours, they recorded everything. The Pritzker Empire is built on a foundation colder than steel: information infrastructure. Their wealth began in real estate, law, and hospitality. Hyatt hotels, office buildings, but those were just the storefronts. The real empire formed in the shadows of data centers, behavioral analytics, and psychological profiling. While other dynasties built monuments, the Pritzkers built mirror worlds, digital reflections of human behavior so precise, so invasive that they no longer needed to control you. They could predict you. Penny Pritzker, former Secretary of Commerce under Obama, wasn't just a bureaucrat. She was the bridge between Silicon Valley, defense intelligence, and corporate consolidation. Under her watch, smart cities were funded, biometric databases were expanded, Cloud networks, once reserved for warfare, were mainstreamed into public life. And guess who benefited? Not the public, but the algorithmic architects, families like hers. The Pritzkers didn't just influence the rise of predictive policing, identity surveillance, and algorithmic bias. They shaped it, funded it, branded it as innovation. You think facial recognition is about safety? No, it's about predictive compliance. You think targeted ads are about convenience? No, they're psychographic leashes, measuring, refining, and manipulating your behavior in real time. And beneath it all, data farms, processing centers, behavioral labs. The Pritzkers are tied to Palantir, to defense contracts, to DARPA initiatives aimed at merging human cognition with artificial surveillance. The goal isn't just to know you, it's to overwrite you, your preferences, your political views, your fears, your identity, until there's no separation between man and machine. That's the final frontier, not domination through force, but intimacy so complete you forget where they end and you begin. This is the Pritzker model. Not tyranny, integration. And once you're integrated, you no longer need to be governed. You'll govern yourself along the invisible tracks they've laid inside your mind. Still think freedom is about flags, freedom is attention, and they already own it. Now we step beyond America, into a bloodline older, blacker, colder, one that sits on a global throne of silence. Next, we face the dynasty whose name is barely whispered. Because they don't operate in the public, they operate in the rituals that decide who lives and who disappears. In every shadowed war, in every vanished regime, in every financial collapse too complex to trace, there is a silent observer. A bloodline that doesn't need statues, headlines, or legacies. Because its power was never meant to be seen, it was meant to be felt. This is the realm of the black nobility, and at its hidden heart, the Orsini family. Ancient, Venetian, untouchable. While most power families bathe in media, the Orsini operate like dark matter, unseen but unavoidable. You won't find them on Forbes. You won't see their name in history textbooks. But trace the veins of war, banking, and papal control, and their shadow looms everywhere. Understand this: the Orsini bloodline dates back over 1,000 years. They were princes of the Vatican before the Vatican wore a crown. Their hands guided the Crusades. Their coin financed inquisitions. Their rituals, yes, rituals, shaped what would become the core ceremonial practices of the Catholic Church itself. They understood early: control the ritual, and you control the rhythm of civilization. Baptism, confession, sacrifice, salvation, all encoded with energetic harvest, feeding not the faithful but the architects. The Orsinis were the first to master what others now mimic: ritual governance. They learned to cloak their control in divinity, to turn spiritual hunger into obedience, to turn political maneuvering into mysticism. You think popes are chosen through prayer? No, they're selected through blood oaths and ancestral debt. And who whispers behind the Sistine walls? The Orsini. Today, their influence spreads not through armies or ballots, but through orders: the Sovereign Military Order of Malta, the Jesuits, the Knights of the Holy Sepulchre. Think these are charities, they are ritual cartels, and their role is simple: enforce the will of the unseen elite on a world that still believes it's free. The Orsinis do not seek fame, they seek continuity, a bloodline that survives collapse after collapse because they write the collapse script. Behind the Rothschild banks, behind the Vatican vaults, behind the intelligence liaisons between MI6 and Mossad, you will find the silent seal of the black nobility. And it's not just in Europe. Because their reach never left, it embedded itself in Washington, in Langley, in the three-letter agencies where exorcism became data extraction and spirituality became surveillance. This is the final gate, and once you walk through it, you can't walk back. Because next, we confront the ultimate inversion, the family that built not an empire, but a reality filter. Where truth isn't hidden, it's fabricated. There's a point in every descent where the question changes. It's no longer, what's being hidden? It becomes, who created the illusion in the first place? Because some families didn't just influence history, they engineered perception itself. And at the core of that machinery stands the Hearst dynasty. They didn't conquer nations. They built the lens through which nations see the world. William Randolph Hearst, the original media tycoon, wasn't just a newspaper magnate. He was the prototype for modern information warfare. Before Fox News, before CNN, before Silicon Valley's attention economy, there was Hearst. He understood a truth the rest of the elite would later master. Reality is negotiable if you own the narrative. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Hearst's empire controlled over 24 major newspapers, magazines, and media channels. And with them, he didn't report the news, he authored it. He pushed America into the Spanish-American War by manufacturing public outrage through fake headlines and staged images. He didn't cover war, he summoned it. And that was just the beginning. Hearst's empire didn't just shape public opinion, it installed belief systems. It decided who was a villain, what was patriotic, what was scandalous, and what was true. It turned minds into mirrors, reflecting not reality, but the story fed to them frame by frame, headline by headline. And the model, it spread. Today, that model has metastasized into every screen you touch. News cycles, social media, streaming platforms. What you love, hate, fear, trust, it's all been engineered by narrative technocrats standing on the bones of the Hearst machine. And yes, they're still here. The Hearst family today still controls vast media holdings: Cosmopolitan, Esquire, Harper's Bazaar, Good Housekeeping, partnerships with Disney and ESPN, medical publications, financial reviews, even textbooks. They're not journalists, they're cognitive architects. And their real product? Consent. Because if they can define what's normal, what's dangerous, what's debunked, and what's real, they don't need to silence you. They just make sure you never think it in the first place. This is no longer just manipulation. It's reality farming, and every day the harvest grows. Now ask yourself, when was the last time you had a thought that didn't come from a screen? One not wrapped in fear, entertainment, or distraction. That silence you just felt, that's you, remembering. And in the next revelation, we face the oldest trick in the dark history of domination, the family that didn't build empires or media. They built enemies, so you'd never look at them. There's a reason you're always at war with something. Terror, drugs, poverty, disease, misinformation. The names change, the targets rotate, but the fear remains constant. That's by design. Because while you're busy fighting shadows, the architects of the fire slip through untouched. And no family has weaponized fear more effectively than the DuPonts. On the surface, they were chemists, industrialists, makers of paint, gunpowder, Teflon. But that's the cover story. In reality, the DuPonts are alchemists of aggression. They've spent centuries turning conflict into currency, fabricating enemies to justify control. Let's pull the veil. The DuPont legacy began with explosives. Gunpowder plants along the Brandywine River during the early 1800s supplied nearly half the munitions used in every major U.S. war, including both sides of the Civil War. Conflict didn't disrupt their business, it fueled it. During World War I, DuPont produced over 1 billion pounds of explosives. In World War II, they helped develop plutonium for the atomic bomb. And after every war, they walked away richer, with new patents, new government contracts, and a population too traumatized to ask who profits from perpetual violence. But it didn't stop with weapons. The DuPonts were pioneers in chemical warfare against the body and mind. Teflon CFCs, leaded gasoline, Agent Orange, glyphosate. These weren't just industrial accidents, they were slow burn attacks on the global nervous system, approved by captured regulators and sold as innovation. You want to know what's darker? The DuPonts helped fund early eugenics programs in the United States, long before Hitler took them global. They believed in genetic hierarchies, selective breeding, behavioral modification, and they poured their wealth into reshaping the population from the inside out. Fear, chemicals, propaganda, it's all one system. And they built it. They are the masters of the unseen war, a war waged not with armies, but with perception, pollution, and policy. Every enemy you've been taught to fear was manufactured in the labs and boardrooms of men who profit from your panic. Every time you rally behind a cause, cheer for a conflict, or trust a cure, ask who benefits if I believe this, and follow the trail. You'll find it lined with DuPont patents, DuPont lobbyists, DuPont dollars. This isn't just industrial history. It's psychological warfare, wrapped in patriotism and sealed with a corporate logo. The DuPonts didn't just make products. They made monsters, and convinced you they were yours. But now, we enter the final circle, the family whose name is buried under layers of myth, wealth, blood, and ritual. They don't run the world, they own the ones who do. Every thread of this descent, every war, every ritual, every whisper of control, leads here. To the family that doesn't seek power, because they are power. Not the kind you see on magazine covers or in election campaigns. This is the root system beneath the empire. Older than nations, darker than religion, colder than capital. The Rothschilds. Yes, that name. Dismissed by the media as conspiracy. Laughed off as internet fiction. Even flagged as antisocial to question. Why? Because no dynasty in modern history has worked so hard to vanish in plain sight. You were taught that the Rothschild banking empire declined in the 20th century, but their assets didn't vanish, they fragmented, dissolved into shell companies. merged into trusts, hidden in sovereign debt, commodity futures, and multilateral investment vehicles that don't carry the Rothschild name, but carry their will. This is a family that once financed both sides of Napoleon's wars, a family that called in debts that decided who ruled Europe. Today, their legacy moves through central banks, IMF restructuring plans, green energy monopolies, media ownership cloaked in ESG compliance and humanitarian branding. But don't get distracted by money. The real Rothschild inheritance is access to everything. World leaders don't meet them, they report to them. Royal bloodlines intermarried with them, not for love but permission. Religions consult them behind closed doors. Tech giants receive their blessing long before IPO. And if you think this is all about Jewish identity, stop right there. The Rothschild power network transcends ethnicity, ideology, nationality. They are post-nation, post-God, post-human. They belong to the ancient club, the one that understands reality not as a playground, but a programmable field. A field governed by numbers, bloodlines, ritual, and silence. You're not supposed to speak their name. That's part of the spell. You can talk about presidents, billionaires, even kings. But this family, they're sacred in the dark hierarchy, because if you truly understood how far their web stretches, you'd realize something horrifying your entire life. The wars you were born into, the laws you obey, the thoughts you think, may not be your own. They are the keepers of the current. And until you name the current, you'll always be swept away by it. Now the descent is complete. Not into hell, into clarity. You've seen the architects. Now choose return to sleep or become one who watches the watchers. Either way, the veil has lifted. You cannot unsee what you now hold.